Jeremiah Jordan has always been told to keep his head down. In his neighborhood, speaking up too much could get you in trouble. At school, he's one of the only black students constantly dealing with microaggressions, unfair treatment, and outright bullying. But Jeremiah isn't weak. He just hasn't found his voice yet. Every day was the same. He'd wake up, get dressed, and go through the motions. At school, he'd take his seat in the back of the class, hoping to stay invisible. It was easier that way. People didn't look at you if you didn't give them a reason to. And Jeremiah had learned from a young age that silence was the safest option. "Yo, Jordan, can you even see the board from back there?" Jeremiah's head snapped up. The voice came from Chris, a kid who sat near the front of the class, always loud, always making comments at his expense. The class was already starting, but Chris still had to get in his jab. Jeremiah didn't answer. He never did. It wasn't worth it. There was no point in engaging with someone who only wanted to tear you down. "I guess not," Chris said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe you should sit up front so you can actually see the teacher, huh?" The rest of the class snickered, and Jeremiah's stomach sank. He tried to ignore it to focus on the lesson, but it was like everything Chris said echoed in his mind. He felt smaller with every passing minute, like he didn't belong in this space, like he was an outsider in a world that wasn't built for him. It wasn't just Chris. It was everyone. Jeremiah had dealt with this kind of treatment for as long as he could remember. The subtle comments, the way people would glance at him when he spoke, the whispering when he walked by. It wasn't always outright bullying, but it still stung. It made him feel like he didn't matter. His mom always told him, "Don't let them get to you, Jeremiah. You're better than that. You're stronger than you think." But she wasn't the one at school, dealing with the stares, the jokes, the looks of pity from teachers who never quite seemed to understand. Jeremiah wanted to believe his mom's words, but sometimes it was hard. How could he be strong when the world kept pushing him down? At lunch, he sat alone. He had his usual spot by the windows, away from the crowds. It was quiet there, a small escape from the chaos of the cafeteria. He didn't mind. Being alone was safer. He didn't have to deal with the looks, the whispers, the feeling of being different. "Hey, Jeremiah." Jeremiah looked up, surprised. It was Olivia, one of the few students who had never treated him like an outsider. She had a warm smile on her face, and for a moment, Jeremiah felt a small spark of hope. "Hey, Olivia," he replied, trying to return the smile but not quite succeeding. Olivia sat down across from him, her tray of food untouched. "You okay?" Jeremiah hesitated. He wasn't used to being asked how he was doing. He didn't know how to answer. "I'm fine," he muttered, looking down at his food. Olivia raised an eyebrow, but didn't push it. "You know, you don't have to go through this alone." Jeremiah felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to believe her, wanted to say that everything was going to be okay, but he couldn't. He didn't have the strength to admit that he was tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of pretending that the hurt didn't bother him. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Jeremiah stood up, ready to retreat back into his shell. But as he walked to his next class, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Maybe it was the way Olivia had looked at him, like she actually saw him. Or maybe it was just the thought of what she'd said, that he didn't have to go through this alone. It was a small thought, a faint glimmer of hope, but for the first time in a long while, Jeremiah wondered if maybe things didn't have to stay this way. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about what Olivia had said. "You don't have to go through this alone." Jeremiah closed his eyes, the weight of the day pressing down on him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like there might be something worth fighting for. The next few days passed slowly for Jeremiah. He tried to keep his head down and stay out of the way, but something inside him had shifted since that conversation with Olivia. For the first time, he was questioning everything he had believed about himself. Maybe he didn't have to stay silent. Maybe he didn't have to be invisible anymore. But the fear still lingered. The fear of standing out, of being judged, of giving people another reason to look down on him. At school, things were the same. Chris was still making his remarks. Ryan still gave him that pitiful look when her paths crossed. But Jeremiah couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed inside him. The weight of all the comments, the microaggressions, the stares, it still hurt, but now it felt like it didn't have to define him. It was after gym class when everything came to a head. Jeremiah had just finished his workout, and was walking to the locker room when he saw Chris and his friends laughing in a corner. It wasn't anything new. They were always making fun of someone. But this time, they were pointing at him. "Hey, Jordan, you sure you want to play basketball?" Chris's voice rang out, loud enough for the entire gym to hear. "I mean, you don't exactly look like you're built for it." Jeremiah stopped in his tracks. His heart started to race. This was the moment. This was the moment where he could either turn around and walk away or face it head-on. He could stay silent like he always did, or he could finally speak up. But his legs didn't move. He couldn't. Chris's words echoed in his mind. "You don't exactly look like you're built for it." The gym grew quieter as people started to notice the tension. It felt like everyone was waiting for him to say something, to do something. But what could he say? Jeremiah didn't know how to fight back with words. He wasn't good at standing up for himself. Then Olivia appeared. She walked over to where Jeremiah was standing, her eyes locked on Chris and his group. She didn't say a word to Jeremiah, but her presence was enough. She stood tall beside him, her shoulders back as if to say, "I've got your back." Chris's smirk faltered as Olivia's gaze never left him. "You've been messing with him for days now," Olivia said, her voice calm but firm. "It's enough." Jeremiah felt his chest tighten. He had never seen Olivia act like this before. She wasn't backing down. She was standing up, not just for him, but with him. Chris scoffed. "What, you think you can just step in and save him?" "He's weak, Olivia. Look at him." But Olivia didn't flinch. She just stood there, unwavering. "No, Chris. You're weak for picking on people who don't fight back. That's not strength. That's cowardice." For a moment, the gym was silent. Jeremiah's mind was racing. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but at the same time, something else was stirring inside him. Something he hadn't felt before, courage. Olivia was standing up for him, speaking out, and it was working. Chris and his friends were being put on the spot, and it felt good. It felt like the world was finally seeing him, not as the quiet kid, but as someone worth standing up for. Jeremiah took a deep breath. He looked at Chris, meeting his gaze for the first time without looking away. "You don't know me," Jeremiah said quietly, but with more strength than he thought he had. "You don't know anything about me. So maybe you should keep your comments to yourself." It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time, Jeremiah didn't stay silent. He didn't let someone walk all over him. It was a small victory, but it was his victory. Chris stared at him, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. For a moment, it looked like he might say something, but then he turned away. His friends followed suit, their laughter dying down as they left the gym. As the gym returned to normal, Olivia turned to Jeremiah. "You did great," she said, offering him a small smile. Jeremiah could barely believe it. He had stood up for himself. It had been hard, and he still felt a knot in his stomach, but he hadn't backed down. "Thanks, Olivia," he replied, his voice a little shaky but stronger than before. "You don't have to go through this alone, Jeremiah," Olivia reminded him, her voice warm. "I'm here. And there are other people who care too." Jeremiah nodded, a new sense of determination growing inside him. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he didn't have the courage to face everything all at once. But today was a start. Today he had found his voice. And maybe, just maybe, he could find the strength to use it more often. The days following the incident in the gym felt surreal to Jeremiah. He couldn't quite wrap his head around it. Standing up to Chris, even with Olivia by his side, had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done. But as the days went on, something strange started to happen. The people who had always ignored him, the ones who had let Chris and his friends get away with their bullying, started to look at him differently. It wasn't like they suddenly became his best friends, but the whispers, the sneers, they stopped. The stares, the sideways glances, they weren't as sharp anymore. Jeremiah wasn't invisible anymore. He had made a small mark, but in that quiet school, it felt like a revolution. Even his teachers seemed to notice the change. Mrs. Anderson, his history teacher, was one of the few who ever seemed to care. She had always been kind, but she didn't really see him. She treated him like everyone else, but after that day in the gym, she started paying more attention. "Jeremiah, I noticed your contribution to today's discussion," Mrs. Anderson said as the class packed up for the day. "You've been quieter lately, but I want you to know your opinion matters." Don't hesitate to speak up more. Jeremiah felt his face flush. Was she talking about the discussion? The one where he barely said anything? But she had heard him. She had noticed. And that small acknowledgement, that recognition, made him feel more seen than he had in years. Still, there was a lingering feeling of unease in his chest. Standing up for himself had felt empowering. But what about the next time? Would it always be like this? Was he going to have to keep fighting, keep pushing, every single day, just to be treated with basic respect? He didn't know the answer. One afternoon, as Jeremiah walked home from school, he heard footsteps behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. It was Marcus, one of the kids who had always kept his distance but never really joined in the bullying. "Hey, Jordan," Marcus called, his voice uncertain. Jeremiah stopped and turned. "What's up, Marcus?" Marcus shuffled his feet, glancing around nervously. "Listen, about the thing with Chris, I just wanted to say, I didn't agree with him. You didn't deserve that." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. This was the last thing he expected. "You didn't say anything," he said, his voice even but guarded. Marcus nodded, looking embarrassed. "Yeah, I know. I should have said something. But I didn't, and I'm sorry." Jeremiah studied him for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had never really considered Marcus a friend, just another face in the crowd. But there was something real in his apology. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Thanks," Jeremiah said finally, his tone softer. "It means more than you know." Marcus smiled faintly, then turned to leave. "No problem, man. See you around." As Jeremiah continued his walk home, his mind was racing. People were starting to notice him in a way he wasn't used to. It was strange and uncomfortable, but it also felt like he was finally being seen for who he was. Not just as the quiet kid who stayed out of trouble, but as someone who had something to say. Later that evening, as he sat on his bed, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Olivia. "Hey, just wanted to check in. You doing okay?" Jeremiah smiled to himself and typed a quick reply. "Yeah, I think I'm doing all right. It's been a weird week, but I'm getting through it." "That's good. You can talk to me anytime, right?" "I mean it. Thanks, Olivia. I really appreciate it." As he set his phone down, Jeremiah realized something important. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. There were people who cared, people who saw him. But the hardest part wasn't over. Chris and his friends might have backed off, but that didn't mean they were done. Jeremiah knew that he had to stay vigilant. He had to be ready for whatever came next. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had the strength to face it. The next day at school, he was walking down the hall when Chris came into view. The sight of him still made Jeremiah's stomach twist. But this time, instead of shrinking away, Jeremiah stood tall. Chris didn't stop. He didn't make any comments, didn't even glance in his direction. For a moment, Jeremiah thought that maybe everything had truly changed. But just as he passed, he heard Chris mutter under his breath, "You'll regret standing up, Jordan. You're not as tough as you think." Jeremiah's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He simply kept walking, and this time he didn't look back. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, he could.